The day it all shifted was the day I thought I was going to lose him forever. We had just laughed over something silly, probably a joke only we could understand, and I caught a glimpse of him staring at me, the kind of look you don't forget. It wasn't just the familiar warmth in his eyes that I had known for years. No, it was something darker, something raw that I didn't know how to process. At first, I shrugged it off. It's just my imagination, I told myself. We were best friends after all. I had never thought of him as anything more than that. He was the guy I called when the world felt too heavy, the one who never judged me when I cried over trivial things. He was the person who helped me pick up the pieces of my life every time it shattered, never asking for anything in return. We were simply there for each other, but that look, it stayed with me. That night, everything came crashing down. I received a call, a frantic, shaky voice on the other end, his. "I can't do this anymore," he said. The words were thick with emotion, each syllable weighted with something I couldn't put my finger on. He told me he couldn't keep pretending, but I didn't understand what he meant. Was he moving away? Had I done something to push him away? My heart began to race as he continued, his voice quivering with pain. "I can't keep hiding from myself." And then, as though the air had been sucked out of the room, he told me something that would change everything. "I love you." I didn't know how to react. My mind scrambled, the words spinning in circles, trying to find something to latch onto, but all I could feel was the sudden, overwhelming pressure in my chest. I had never thought of him that way. I had never imagined that our friendship could be anything other than what it was. But in that moment, when he whispered those words, when he laid his heart bare for me to see, I realized that I didn't know him as well as I thought I did. He wasn't just my best friend anymore. He was someone whose feelings I had overlooked, whose love had been quietly building up in the shadows, unseen by me. And now, in the span of a single phone call, everything I thought I knew about him and about us was shattered. I didn't know how to respond. The world felt like it had tilted sideways and I was struggling to find my footing. I knew I should have said something, anything, to make sense of it, to comfort him, but I couldn't find my voice. The silence stretched out between us like an abyss, thick and suffocating. I heard his breathing on the other end, ragged, as if he too was unsure of what would come next. Are you still there?" he asked, his voice small and vulnerable. I nodded instinctively, even though he couldn't see me. "I didn't mean to drop this bomb on you," he continued, his words rushed, like he was afraid of being interrupted. "I've been hiding it for so long, and I thought maybe I could keep pretending like it wasn't there, but I can't. Not anymore." His confession hung in the air, pulling me deeper into a world I had never imagined, a world where everything I thought was certain now seemed fragile, even fake. The friendship we shared, so steady, so unshakable, suddenly felt like a house of cards, teetering on the edge of collapse. The more I tried to hold on to it, the more it slipped through my fingers. And then came the twist. As I tried to process what he was telling me, my mind raced, but I found myself circling back to one thought that refused to leave me. What if I feel the same way? The idea was terrifying, yet somehow comforting, like discovering a part of yourself that you had buried deep, afraid to confront. I had never questioned my feelings for him. Sure, I loved him. He was my best friend, my confidant, the person who had seen me at my worst and loved me anyway. But love in that way, love as more than just friendship, it never occurred to me to consider it. It felt too complicated, too risky. We were perfect as we were, right? But the more I tried to deny it, the more the truth clawed at me. The heartache in his voice, the way he confessed his feelings so rawly, it started to stir something in me. I couldn't just dismiss him. I couldn't pretend it didn't matter. What do I do now? I asked myself, my hands trembling as I gripped the phone. In that moment, I was faced with a decision that would change the course of my life. I could tell him that I felt the same way, that I had loved him in silence for years, or I could reject him, turn my back on everything we had. But rejection wasn't just about saying no, it was about losing him entirely. And that thought, more than anything, made me realize just how much he meant to me. So I took a deep breath and said the only thing that felt right, even though it terrified me. I think I love you too. The silence that followed my confession felt like a lifetime. My heart was beating in my throat, and for a moment I wondered if I had made a mistake, if perhaps I had rushed into something I wasn't ready for. But then I heard him exhale slowly, as if he had been holding his breath the entire time. "I didn't expect you to say that," he whispered, his voice thick with disbelief and relief. And in that moment, I realized how much I had underestimated the depth of his feelings, how long he had been carrying that weight on his own, silently aching for something he thought he would never have. But the reality of what we had just said, and what it meant, hit me like a freight train. It wasn't just a confession of love. It was the unspoken acknowledgement that everything we had ever known was about to be completely transformed. I had never looked at him in that way, not consciously anyway. But now, with the truth hanging between us, I couldn't unsee it. The way his eyes sparkled when he laughed, the small gestures he made to comfort me when I was low, suddenly, they all took on new meaning. It was as though I had been blind to what had been right in front of me all this time, and now that I could finally see it, I didn't know what to do with it. We agreed to meet up the next day to talk face to face about what we had just unlocked. But even as I tried to prepare myself, I knew it wasn't going to be easy. There were so many things we hadn't considered: the consequences, the risks, the way our families and friends would react. I wasn't naive. I knew that love in any form was complicated. But what scared me most was the fear that this might ruin everything we had built together. Was I willing to lose the friendship I cherished so deeply in the hope of something more? And what if it didn't work? What if, in the end, love wasn't enough to overcome the weight of what we were about to face? The next day, when I saw him standing there, waiting for me, something shifted again. He was still the same person, the one who knew me better than anyone else, the one who had seen me at my worst and still stayed. But there was something in his eyes now, something I had never noticed before: vulnerability, hope, fear. It wasn't just the look of a friend anymore. It was the gaze of someone who was putting everything on the line, risking everything for a chance at something more. And in that moment I knew we couldn't go back. There was no going back. Whatever came next, we would face it together. But the truth was, I wasn't just scared of losing him. I was terrified of losing myself. As we sat across from each other, the weight of everything hung in the air, thick and unspoken. We were no longer two friends having a casual conversation over coffee. We were two people standing on the precipice of something huge, something dangerous, and something beautiful. I had never felt this much tension before, this sense of wanting something but being afraid of what it might cost. He reached for my hand, his touch hesitant at first, like he wasn't sure if I would pull away. But I didn't. I let him hold it, and for a brief moment everything felt right. His hand was warm, grounding me in a way nothing else had. But the reality of what we were doing kept clawing at my insides. He stared at me, his eyes searching mine as though waiting for me to tell him that this was a mistake, that we could go back to being just friends. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't lie to him, not anymore, not after everything we had just uncovered. What if we ruin everything? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The question hung between us like a fragile thread, and for a moment he didn't answer. Instead, he squeezed my hand, his eyes soft but serious. What if we don't? He finally replied, his voice steady, though his emotions were anything but. What if we're just scared of the unknown? What if this is the one thing that could finally make us whole? His words hit me like a wave, washing over me with a force I couldn't escape. He wasn't wrong. We had spent our entire lives taking the safe route, hiding in the shadows of what we thought we should be, never daring to look at what could be. But here we were, in the light, facing something real, something messy and complicated and beautiful. And as much as I wanted to run from it, I knew deep down that this was the only way forward. We talked for hours, peeling back layers of our past, our fears, and the future we couldn't yet see. There were moments of laughter, moments of rawness where we admitted things we had never dared to voice before, not even to ourselves. But with every passing minute, I felt something growing between us, something undeniable. I could see him in a way I had never seen before, not just my friend, but someone I could love. And I realized that this was not a decision I could undo. We were no longer just two people trying to figure out where we fit in each other's lives. We were two people deciding to take a leap into the unknown together. But just as I began to think we might have a chance, just as I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could make this work, he said something that took me completely off guard. "I don't want to hurt you," he said quietly, looking away, his voice trembling. "I don't want us to fall apart if this doesn't work. I can't lose you." It was the first time he had said anything that sounded like doubt. It hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a split second I questioned everything. What if he was right? What if we were risking too much? What if the love we had for each other wasn't enough to hold us together when the world turned against us? His words echoed in my head long after we left the cafe, long after we had parted ways, each of us still wrestling with what we had just admitted. I didn't want to believe that fear could tear us apart. I didn't want to think that love, something so pure, could collapse under the weight of uncertainty. But as the days passed, I began to feel it, the shift. There were moments when everything felt just as it always had, when we laughed about nothing and reveled in the comfort of knowing each other so well. But then there were the other moments, the silent pauses between words, the unspoken things we hadn't yet figured out. The way we both seemed to step around the subject of us, as if acknowledging it could be the spark that lit everything on fire. And then came the day I nearly lost him again. I had tried to reach out to ask him how he was feeling, to continue the conversation we had started, but each time I was met with distance. His texts were brief, his calls short and distracted. The vulnerability he had shown me, his fear, his hope, the part of him he had never shared before, had been replaced by an unfamiliar coldness. He wasn't pulling away because he didn't care. No, it was the opposite. He was protecting himself, bracing for the inevitable moment when everything would crumble, and I couldn't blame him. I was doing the same thing. We had both opened ourselves up to something we didn't know how to handle, and now we were both paralyzed by the fear of what would happen next. It all came to a head one night when I could no longer stand the silence between us. I showed up at his door, my heart pounding in my chest. He answered, looking as though he hadn't expected me, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of us spoke. But then, as if the walls we had built around ourselves came crashing down, he stepped aside and let me in. We sat in his living room, the same spot where we had shared our secrets for years. But now it felt different, heavy. "I think I'm in love with you," I said, the words finally spilling out like a confession I had kept hidden for too long. "I know it's messy and I don't know what's going to happen, but I can't keep pretending I don't feel this way." He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes softening, and then, slowly, he smiled. The kind of smile that melted away all the fear, all the uncertainty. "You don't have to keep pretending," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm in love with you too." And in that instant, everything shifted again. It was like a switch had been flipped, and suddenly the weight of the world was lifted. We didn't have all the answers. We didn't know what the future held, but we had each other. And sometimes, in the messiest moments of life, that's all you need to keep going. The love that had once been buried in the shadows, unspoken and uncertain, was now laid bare between us, and it was stronger than anything either of us had ever imagined. He was no longer just a friend. He was my true love,